Okay, we should start. Can you all hear me? Should I use the mic? Okay, good. So welcome to Social and Cultural Dynamics this year. What we're gonna do is we're gonna do a brief introduction today and also explain you why it's me and not a guy called Arnaud here. Luckily, Christiana is still there and she'll be the staple of the course. We're going to be discussing what we're going to learn and why, from the general idea of the course to the skills that we will acquire, how the exam is actually a good way of getting you to learn what we want you to learn, how we deal with lectures, readings, and practical exercises. And then depending on the time, it varies a bit from year to year. When I teach this course, we might already start discussing cognition in a social context. And okay, this is me most of the time when I'm not at university, sometimes even when I'm at university, because the Danish system cannot coordinate school holidays and university holidays. I'll just move these away. Yes. Oh. I was one of the 4 people who founded Cognitive Science, together with Josh Skews, with Christian Tulane, and with Mikkel Valentin. But as all of them, I was never trained as a cognitive scientist. I started as a semiotician, as somebody who works on how we make sense of things, which, if you want, is not that very far from cognitive science. But the approach was very humanistic, qualitative. We did read a lot of philosophy, a lot of French deconstructionist stuff. We discussed how wine makes sense, which was very fantastic, and movies and literature. It was really an amazing experience studying that. Now I identify as a cognitive scientist. I even, faked it till I made it, and the university hired me as a cognitive scientist. Don't ask me why. I mostly spend my time working on computational methods and statistical methods, on empirical, sometimes even experimental data. But there is still a lot of my former training that gets through the way I do cognitive science. And I think that it will shine through the course. But, you'll see. But basically is that when I think of cognition, I think of information processing. And when I look at information processing in the word, it's a collective meaning-making process, right? As you make a decision, like what university to choose, you probably didn't sit alone in your room in the dark, and try to sort of reason your way through. You talk to other people. You maybe found a buddy that would come here as well. You sort of discuss things with your parents. You read things on the internet. So you were processing information in a very coupled way with the environment, especially with other people. When we start to think about that, right, there's very complex interdependencies between the components of the process, which is what brought me to just do a lot of statistics and computational modeling. I also work on neurodiversity and psychiatric conditions. So conditions like autism, schizophrenia, other kinds of psychotic disorders, depression, bipolar disorder, as ways to explore the fact that we can think together. We can do things in the world in very many different ways. And looking at different ways gives us some insight also on more traditional way of thinking, right? It takes us out of the blindfolds that just make us see the things as the people before us saw them. I work on models, like computational models, agent-based models, statistical models, as semiotic artifacts, as cultural tools that we use to think. And this is also something that will be kind of a red thread throughout the course, where we will be talking a lot about models because changing the models that we use changes the way we can think. You can't do everything with the GLM, right? It pushes you in certain direction, but there are other things that you can do. I also tend to reflect on what I'm doing and what we're doing from a meta angle, because science is a cultural practice, a social dynamic, where the things that we read, the questions that we ask are deeply shaped by the traditions where we are. We will have actually a whole class on that. If you want to read more about what I do, there's articles on Google Scholar, there's academic talks on YouTube, but also, you'll have to deal with me talking about my research every now and then. Just as a side note, this is a bit of an ad, but when you'll have to decide your bachelor thesis projects and the like, I will share a Google Sheet page where I have a bunch of projects. And in general, I'm interested in projects on quantitative and modeling analysis of conversation and other social behaviors. We won't talk too much about that because you already had CogCom, but that's the kind of angle that I'm always very excited to talk about. Why am I here? Well, there was supposed to be Arnaud Canton Vermier teaching you. I don't know if you know him already, but unfortunately, he has a family situation that he needs to deal with. So 2 weeks before the course, I got an email from Josh. And so here I am. Luckily, I actually taught this course the first 5 or 6 times it was offered. There is some adjustments that I had to do because I already had planned my semester, but we'll figure it out together. And I'm super excited to be teaching this course again with you. Yes? Yeah. I don't know if we have, because that one cannot be opened. Yeah, okay. And then I'll also mention, yeah, okay. I also mentioned at this point that all the lectures, not the classes, but the lectures are streamed on Zoom and recorded, so you can watch them at any time. This is not to discourage you from attending. Actually, do attend. Like, you get the most by attending. But if you don't feel well, if you have whatever happens, all the lectures are there. You don't need to stress about that. Good. Then there's our pillar. There is Pastiana there. Do you want to say a few words? A very good bachelor thesis. Mm. And I'm very grateful that you were gently pushed towards social and cultural dynamics. Good. So this is gonna be a bit hopeless for me because since I had kids, I my memory just completely went. But I actually wanted a very quick round of names so I can sort of start hoping to learn some names. And when you comment and ask a question, if it at least for the first couple of weeks actually give your name, that would actually be very helpful to me. Could we start with a round of names? Yes. It's- Okay. Yeah. Thanks. I'll get to know a few of the names at least. Okay, so the course. We start as usual from the study regulations because that's what we need to follow, right? So you have to develop knowledge. That and this knowledge will involve demonstrate understanding. You'll be able to demonstrate understanding of the effect of social and cultural processes on cognition. You will need to be able to explain how cognitive processes involved in communication and interaction scale up in larger social contexts. And you can see how the idea is to build from CogCom into social and cultural dynamics. And you will be able to explain the role of cognitive processes in shaping and maintaining cultural patterns. There's a second component of what you will learn, that's skills. And I have to be honest, these tripartition of the Danish system never really made sense to me, but we spent a couple of years carving these definitions. So you will need to be able to critically evaluate cognitive explanations of cultural and social phenomena. And very crucial, you will need to design studies to test cognitive explanation of social and cultural phenomena. Finally, in terms of competences, you will need to be able to consider the ethical significance of the effect of research on social and cultural dynamics, for instance, in policy development, technology development, etc. You'll notice that all of these definitions, they are pushing us in certain direction, but they are as empty as possible because there is always a trade-off when writing study regulations in terms of allowing different teachers to come in and teach the course. In terms of changing study regulation is hell. We've done it a few times now. It's hell. So keeping them a bit abstract allows us also to adjust the target on a year-by-year basis according to your feedback and how the word moves, right? But the basic idea you can see here is that you have certain skills and knowledges already. You know about cognitive processes. You know something about study design. You know something about statistics. And what we're going to do now is we're going to see if we start looking at the larger picture, at the context in which cognitive processes happen, in which decisions are made, right? In which opinions are formed. Can we use your skills and develop them to understand this broader context, right? I have slides on that, but I tend to go a bit back and forth according to how the rant is going. They pay me to rant. Isn't that amazing? Uh, so think even in a very simple case, you work in a company that has to make changes to their website and they want to know how that changes buying decisions in their customers, right? These customers make decisions on what to buy in a social context, right? Depending on which values are spread at that point, depending on whether other people are buying the same things and blah and blah. And you actually want to be able to consider these broader contexts, right? If you think of a clinical environment, in work in psychiatry or actually in a lot of departments, there is something about trying to figure out the functioning of the ability of a patient to function in society. And a lot of the time, there are tests that people run about, social cognition, theory of mind, and so on. But they reflect very poorly on how these patients are able to actually function in society. And so being able to broaden out your toolbox is something that is actually very crucial if you think about how do we help patients with schizophrenia to reintegrate after a psychotic outbreak. Or, if we have patients with diabetes who need to inject at regular times, right? How do we ensure that it doesn't feel like an embarrassment and an impediment to go out, the fact that they have to inject, which is usually associated with a social stigma. What are you injecting? Right? So this is how I think I'm going to use the Blackboard, but I also put everything on the slides if there's anybody on Zoom. But basically, I really love this Blackboard that I can move up and down. So here we have a human, right? The object of cognitive science. And a lot of what you've been doing before, right, is trying to figure out what's going on there. Or we give them a computer with some stimuli, some dots, right? And we want to know how here, right, in the mind, people process visual information, make decisions based on this visual or auditory or whatever information, remember things, and so on and so forth. Sometimes think it has been actually scaled down a bit, but let me know if that's not the case, right? We also work on what is called social cognition, which is we don't just try to understand how people think about dots on a screen, but we also try to understand how people think about other people, right? Have you had lots of social cognition, theory of mind, a bit of theory of mind? Yes. Imitation, like mirror neurons and that sort of things. Okay, so you have some ideas. And most often, especially in the old days, it's all again based on computers where you see small vignettes. But sometimes you might even be observing a second person, right? So you can see we start from a certain ways of thinking about cognition. We are expanding a little bit, right? So, but these two people, if we take the computer or the mobile away, they might actually interact, right? So in CogCom, you probably had a bit of stuff on conversations and social interaction. Who did you do a CogCom with? Anna Soilund. Okay, so you did it last semester. Oh, yeah. You did it last. So you started with Fabio and you finished with Anders. Okay, yeah. So you were the pure Anders. Yeah, good. Yes. And So we know that there's different ways in which we can use language to engage each other. We can use our bodies to engage each other. And there's different ways in which information passes, right? Whether we then consider this circle cognition or cognition is only happens inside people here, that's a philosophical point. But as long as we think this is interesting, I'm fine, right? We won't discuss that too much, but sometimes these two people or three or four, your study groups, actually have to solve problems together, right? You have to figure out how the heck you're going to pass that portfolio assignment 1 in methods 4. You're at this stage, right? Oh my God, what is this Bayesian stuff? My head is exploding. Can we please think through it together, right? And this is something that we will focus on the next week of lecture. And as you'll see in the calendar, it's not next week, but it's in 2 weeks. We will discuss experiments that we can do in a dyadic setup or in a teamwork setup, and we will do the practical exercise in week 2, exactly trying to figure out good ways of exploring teamwork experimentally. And economists have been dealing with these sort of situations in terms of game theory. Do you know what game theory is? Right. We will have a whole week on that or 2, starting from week 6. And game theory is an attempt at formalizing a behavioral interdependence between 2 or more agents structured by incentives. Yesterday, I was teaching cognitive modeling, and we played for half an hour the matching pennies game. You know the matching pennies game? Where's the chalk, right? You say it's here, then I hide it again, then I say, where's the chalk? It's here, right? And game theory would say there's 2 possible moves in each of the agents, right or left, right or left. This is agent 1 and this is agent 2. If agent 1 has picked right and agent 2 has picked right, agent 1 gets a -1 and agent 2 gets a +1, right? One wins, the other loses. If we go here, then it's the opposite because the guesser hasn't guessed, right? And here it's the same. -1, -1, +1. This is basically, we go here and we say, is there a place where behaviors are optimal for both people? And in this specific case, the answer is no, right? Because if I win, you lose. And that's why I'm using it in cognitive modeling, because it's an unstable game, requires complex strategies. In other conditions, you have the prisoner dilemma. You know the prisoner dilemma, right? So there, if you both collaborate, you get the optimal result. But in case the other defects, you're best off by defecting. Therefore, there's a stable equilibrium of defecting, right? We'll deal with that. But it's just to say there are tools and ways to think in formalized and quantifiable ways about interactions. And we'll give you the basics to do that. Next. Those 2 people are rarely alone. As a person with kids, you're rarely alone with your partners. There's always a bunch of other people. And this is also the case of a lot of the situations in which we learn, right? We're not on a one-on-one. You could imagine that in certain or in many contexts, like a one-on-one teacher-student situation is the best way to learn at your tempo and getting all the explanations you want, right? But it's not economically viable. Therefore, we have classrooms. It's also fun to be with peers, right? You wouldn't want to have me ranting at you for 6 hours, right? At least you can roll your eyes at your peer there, right? And so as we broaden these to more people interacting. Right? Then we have teamwork of the sort that you have in your study group, where you have 3, 4 people. We have teamwork at the scale of a department, a company, and so on, or a team, sports team, how they actually interact with each other. We can scale this up to, for instance, say there are social phenomena which are at a large scale but could be conceptualized as teamwork, like scientific research. Right? We are trying to solve problems. And even if there is a whole narrative in media and movies and books and career incentives that you and only you will be able to solve this problem, this is not how it works, right? It's a team effort. There's no question that anybody really in the history of science has answered alone without building on the shoulders of previous people, exchanging letters at that point, emails at this point, going to conferences and exchanging ideas. And in week 3, we will actually try to do that and see if what we learn in week 2, based on psychological study and group dynamics, is interesting and valid. Can we actually scale it up to understand how science works? What kind of insights do we get by doing that? There are specific methods that have been used to scale up our approaches to many people. For instance, networks, understanding these person not in terms of the person that they are, but in terms of how they connect to other people. But also agent-based modeling, which is formalizing very simplified models of people, doing a simple thing usually, and then creating multiple of those agents and simulating how their behavior changes over time. How people, agents, let me think of an example that I haven't thought before, but for instance, there's an example that you will have to go through. I'm actually not anticipating that, sorry, but think about COVID times, right? Your propensity to go out depends on the propensity of other people to go out. And your propensity or probability of getting contagious, it depends on what the other people are doing, right? And by looking at the social information around you, you change the way that you make a decision, but these changes might spiral out and create emerging behaviors, right? And we will do agent-based modeling roughly between week 5 and 7 of the course. Just for the fun of it, I added this, which is, in many cases, we have something called adversarial interactions or group level structures. There's plenty of fun studies. I'll actually add a video because we won't have too much time to go into that these days, but I have a video from previous versions of the course where I go through some of the cool research on how groups, just because they're groups, tend to suddenly start processing information from other people and interacting with other people that are not part of the group in different ways. And you can have that because you're studying cognitive science and suddenly there's a group of psychologists here who but it could also be that as you enter, I give you at random a red t-shirt and a green t-shirt. Well, not if you're colorblind, and a blue t-shirt. And then I have you do experiments in which you might be interacting with somebody with a red t-shirt or with a blue t-shirt, and your behavior will change. Right? Good. However, this is also very partial, right? These assumes that as we act here and now just depends on what is around us. But we have histories of interactions, right? So I come from Italy. You can expose me to brennende kærlighed and cabbage and I can't remember how you call the curry and meatballs and rice. Balekare, yes, because my partner is Faroese and they call it reis, high polyrase. Uh, but yes, no matter how much everybody around me is eating these curry soup and enjoying it and making, you will not get me to appreciate it. Sorry. Right. So there is a whole vertical dimension added to this, which is the creation and negotiations of cultural traditions. We inherit, well, either develop over time or inherit, or a mix of the two, ways of seeing things, ways of doing things, right? And in order to understand these dimensions better, we will be talking about cultural transmission and evolution in week 7 and week 8. And these phenomena, the way that we receive information vertically or evolve the information that we receive, is can be modeled using agent-based models that we will cover, experiments of this kind that we will also cover in week 8, which might or might not involve transmission chains. So attempts at creating cultural transmission in the lab. Okay, why are we learning this? I hope I already started making a case for that. But for instance, I was at a certain point involved in a project on schizophrenic patients agreeing with their main provider of care about medication treatment. And one of the big issues in the in the schizophrenia treatment world is that the patients, as part of the symptomatology, often stops taking the medications. It's also something quite common in bipolar disorder, right? Because the bipolar medication, lithium, and so on have quite heavy side effects. Also, the manic periods are actually kind of nice to have, I hear, until they break. And so, how do we help the decision taken by the patient about the medication to be a stable decision, right? Not because we want to force the patient to take the medication, but once there is that decision, right? What are the conditions that allow us to do that? And for instance, the presence of family members who are involved from the start in the decision changes the dynamics of adherence. The way in which the patient tends to process and react to information during the conversation also has a good predictive power. It doesn't help per se, but it has a good predictive power to know whether there are potential issues. And broadening our gaze helps us dealing better and more creatively with these situations. We also, I think I made this slide during COVID, right? We need to understand why people would wear masks or not, why they would vaccinate or not, and so on and so forth. It's actually even more important than ever now with the health minister of the United States having funny ideas. So we use Teams all the time, right? You are, for me as a student who has had worked in Italy or studied in Italy, in the States, and in the UK, this whole idea of the study groups in Denmark was just what, right? Like you're not studying on your own. Like, why are you picking a study group for me? Do you think I don't have friends? There are reasons, right? But we also know that study groups have a tendency to fail sometimes. There's issues of free riding. There's issue of people not being compatible. There's issue of foreign students having to work night shifts and therefore not being as available for the study group activities and so on and so forth. So we want to understand how teamwork works, right? If we do that, we can actually design better teams, so better strategies to support the teams. These, funnily enough, is not just something that is for study groups and people in a company, but it is something that is actually very valuable in machine learning. There is this idea called machine learning ensembles, which is, if you know, random forests, XGBoost, and the like, but now it's actually moving also to federated learning in deep learning systems. Sometimes you can train a much simpler model, but diversify by either making 1,000 copies and giving different features to each of the copies, or different cases to each of the copies, and then having all of them make a prediction, and combining somehow the prediction helps getting better predictions. And funnily enough, a lot of the things that we can learn from humans on how to create a good study group hold true for how we create good machine learning ensembles. Right? So also, we're in a lucky period, right? We're at a time in which large digital data sets are making it possible to better understand cultural variability and historical processes, right? There's basically all of the parliaments in Europe have made available digital copies of at least a decade of their parliamentarians' debates, which is a very, very good, though partial, uh, access to decision making at large scale, for instance, to how discourse moves. Um, there's social media who are doing very interesting things, even if Twitter is collapsing. Still, there's interesting stuff to understand. And right, there's lots of talk about how misinformation is shaping electoral behaviors, how it's shaping health behaviors. Right, we want to understand this. We want to do better. Also, game theory and agent-based models are increasingly used in data science problems. So data science problems are not just machine learning problems. Uh, for instance, I was a consultant for a big pharmaceutical companies a few years ago, where as they developed, now they dropped the whole line of research because it was a mess, but as psychiatry is a mess, but as they tried to develop new psychiatric medications, you want to be able to continuously assess how the patient is doing. You cannot bring the patient or participant in the clinic every day. That's too expensive, both in terms of the life quality of the patient and of the clinical practitioners. You want to bring them at most once a week. But what if a serious side effect develops? Right? You want to catch it very quickly. One day, both because you want to catch it, but also because you can't imagine how expensive it is to have one more day of clinical trial. Like these things are, you know, hundreds of billions of krona expensive. So it's, let's say, billions of euros. I think better that way. That would be tens of billions of kronas expensive. Yes. Um, so one of the things that they wanted to do is, can we create some engaging data collection activity on their mobile that we could actually get them to play once a day? And that would tell us something. In a hospital in Barcelona, they even did this super cool study where, as I told you, relatives of patients with psychosis are very crucial in helping them getting better or keeping stable. And what they did is they used small games analyzed with game theory to understand how likely the different relatives were to help the patient when the need would arise. There's lots of work being done these days in team sports, right? How do we make decisions made in a team in the heat of the game better? How do we give tools to the players to actually think of their behaviors in a team in a more productive way? That's also where game theory is being used, as well as agent-based models. I think now it's actually declassified, so I can talk about that. I'm not going to mention the team. There was a team that had been collecting data on their players, football team. I don't understand anything about European football, soccer, but a student of mine wanted to do that thesis. So this famous Danish team had started collecting data on positions in the field at a millisecond level. And they wanted to not just evaluate the players as their strength and the accuracy in kicking the ball and blah, but also in how they coordinated in space during the game. And very, very long story short, it was a very painful thesis, but really cool. If we took models of sheep flocking or fish flocking, and we extracted the parameters from those models, that is the orientation at which the players were standing compared to the others and the relative velocity, we could actually predict very well defense performance of the team. But we couldn't really predict offense. 1 week before a submission date, we found a paper from the 80s on wolves and how they coordinate in attacking a prey. So that would have been a very cool thing, but she needed to submit. The students actually got a really, really good job at that point at IBM, who was trying to start a data analytics for sports. So this stuff is super relevant. But generally, and this is that's been one of my really pet peeves in designing these education and in keeping on pushing where the education should be. This is a course where you develop your competencies, right? You do more study design. You get to deal with different computational and statistical models. You need to write a report and really train your communication skills, which are going to be super crucial no matter what you decide to do after your bachelor. And I think this is probably a good time to take a break. So let's take 10 minutes break, and I'll stop the recording. Okay, we should start. Right. So we discussed a bit the kind of things that we, and it's both a royal we, but also like the education way, the way we thought this course, the things that we want you to learn. And now we can see, well, yes. So the goal is we want to grant you new cognitive science superpowers, right? That is, we want to give you new conceptual tools to look at all sort of interesting phenomena and start working at explaining them. We want to strengthen your ability to identify such phenomena, design a study, analyze it, and report it in meaningful ways. And as a bit of a personal philosophy, right? This is actually something that came out in previous classes. You are reading or studying at the same time cognitive neuroscience, and depending on the teacher you have, sometimes cognitive neuroscience gives you the feeling that a lot of knowledge has been accumulated in that field. And it's a question for you to actually learn that knowledge. And after the course, you know much better how the brain works. And then you come to my course, Social and Cultural Dynamics, where I'm just, oh, unless people are doing this and that's bullshit, and let's think critically about that. And we don't really know anything about this, and let's think about that. It's a really cool problem. We don't know anything about that. And that would be a refrain again and again. And you would get the feeling that maybe we should have waited like 10 or 20 years before teaching social and cultural dynamics, because there's not enough like core knowledge that you can actually say you've learned at the end of the course. Now, the course has been restructured to not give you that feeling that much. But really, it is a personal philosophy that science is very changeable. Not in a bad way, but because we keep on learning. And I do research in things I find interesting. I often come from angle a different discipline or a different angle, and then suddenly I discover that what is in the textbook is not true, right? And that's something that happens to me again and again and again. So I think that I tend to put much more focus not on the facts, on learning specific tidbits of knowledge, because I am 100% sure that 80% of what I could teach you as knowledge will be obsolete by the time you finish. Right? The impact of misinformation, what we know about it, what we know about how much it influenced people's decision has shifted radically in the last 5 years that I've been following it. Right? So I really, really put the focus on teaching you how to think and how to do things, how to create studies, how to think critically, how to come to a field and try to formulate meaningful research questions. And that sometimes makes me overemphasize how little we know, because I'm saying there's a lot of stuff that you can do. Right? This is my philosophy. This is how I do my research. This is how I think the world is. Uh, I've tried to dampen it down, but just be aware that it's not necessarily an issue of which discipline is more established, which discipline has more facts. It's actually a question of teaching philosophy. I had a slide which I took off because it was a bit too provocative about where the Broca's area is, where there's a fantastic meta-analysis where I think they take 152 papers reporting results on Broca's areas. They take a map of the brain, and then they overlay where the Broca's areas are positioned. And let's say that there's very little overlapping. We discovered Broca's areas in the 19th century, right? We teach it as a very well-established fact. You draw your conclusions. This is not to mean that Broca's areas is a useless concept. It's a pragmatically useful concept. It's just not a hardcore of knowledge as sometimes is presented in early courses. It's good that we have different approaches in teaching, so you don't get completely lost as you would be if it was only me teaching all the courses. It's also good that you get a bit of more, we actually don't know anything, so you can combine the two approaches and be more critical. Good. So the exam, is a free take-home assignment, is exactly like communication and cognition. And we haven't been able to change the study regulations yet because there's all these university reforms coming in. It will come, but you still have to write it in groups of maximum 3 students. I know it's super annoying if you want to do something with your study group. I had, over the years, many creative solutions that can be adopted. For instance, you do 2x2 factorial design, and one group of 2 people focuses on one and the other focuses on the other 2. Or I had some people working on, can we generalize models that try to predict whether you have schizophrenia or not from voice in English, and generalize it to Danish. And the other 2 people who said, can we do it starting from Danish and going to English? Or even had some people were working on some data I had on schizophrenia. The 2 other people were writing exactly the same code, but running it on data that I had on autism, and that allowed them to work together most of the time, but to submit to different assignments. This is just to say, I'm very open to creative solution. The formal requirement is groups of 1, 2, 3. You have to design a study, you have to collect the data in some way, which might simply mean getting access to a data set. You have to analyze it, you have to report. Manuscript has to be coherent, but with clearly separated contributions if you're more than 1 person. As you will see when I'll teach teamwork, if they're really clearly separated and I can see these has been written by A and these has been written by B, probably teamwork has failed. But there has at least to be your initials that says this chapter is more responsibility of A and this chapter is more responsibility of B for formal reasons. The length is 10 to 12 standard pages for one student, 17 to 22 for two, 24 to 32 for three students. You should take these as a chance to explore a new topic, or if you got really excited about your CogCom, you could build the next step. You could also, think of these. It's really, where do we have it? You do your CogCom, which is your very first, university paper. Then you do your SocKult, right, where you get to the next level. And these is really to prepare you to your bachelor thesis, right? So you can also see this as, oh, I have this really crazy idea or really ambitious idea for my bachelor thesis that I would want to do. Can I boil it down to something more smaller or more tractable, do it for this exam and see whether I can then build up for that on my bachelor thesis. I think, Christiane, that's what you did, right? Yeah. So I'm very open to, oh, yes. Did you do? Oh, yeah, sorry. That's because the last time I taught SocKult, it was questions exam. Yes. But yeah. And do you write the full report or is that study design full report? Okay, good to know. Thanks. Great, fantastic. Now I'll expect way more from you. Yes. Uh, in general, what counts as a SocKult topic? I am very open-minded, right? It has, sometimes I have students trying to push a paper that they wrote from some other exam, right? Or a topic that clearly is not using any of the literature that we covered. That's stretching it a bit too much, but trying to find any sort of topic where you can apply concepts or tools that we worked on here, I'm very open-minded. So you can be exploratory, you can have as much fun as you want. I think a favorite paper of mine was trying to figure out whether swingers club spread kinks or whether people went to swingers clubs that share their own kinks. And that was a lot of fun, I can promise you. uh, uh, Also remember, this is an exam topic, exam thesis, so it has a limited length. So it's super cool to be exploratory and ambitious, but remember to sort of boil it down to something simple. We're doing this because own studies are fun, but also are a very great way to actually learn hands-on. Perhaps because many of the founders of this education never studied cognitive science, but we all learned to do these things by doing projects. And by doing projects, so actually, do you know Jonathan? What's his name? Jonathan. Okay, I forget the surname, but he finished last year his master in a CogSci here, and now he's doing a PhD in Oxford. And his supervisor told him, like, why can you do stuff that only our third year PhD students can do, right? Because they had focused all their previous studies on learning stuff, very little on doing. And sometimes that leaves gaps in your education by doing lots of spotty things, but it makes you able to very quickly fill them in. Or at least that's what I tell myself since I send my kids to a Danish school. Okay, I think I went through that already. And so I know it's scary. Now you actually had two already papers, so maybe it's less scary for you than for my last class doing this, but we'll be serious helping you prepare, right? For every lecture, I think, or if not every, almost every, I think every, we were able to find some former exam papers. Sometimes you only have the papers. Sometimes you actually have even a short video of the students presenting their work. And they're linked in the different units in the content stuff on Brightspace. Examples of possible studies will be mentioned during lectures. We will have a few practical exercises where we do mock-ups of possible studies to different levels. So for instance, in week 2 of the course, we will do together experiment on what makes a good pair in playing Scrabble. And in week 4 or 3, in week 3, we will actually do a brainstorm. How would we design exam papers around the issue of applying teamwork dynamics to science? And so on. And so we'll do a lot of these kind of exercises. For every lecture, there is a Wanna Dig Deeper section with books and additional articles that you can explore if you think this topic is what makes me really intrigued. And I also have Google Sheet that I had mentioned before, where I have, whenever I have an idea for a project, for a bachelor thesis or a master or whatever, I just throw it in there. So you can just look for inspiration. We will also have several supervision weeks where we actually work directly with the groups to help you in your specific project. And the very last week, we will do the What a Good Idea Fair, in which we will ask you to produce very short video presentations of your idea. We will organize you in groups so that we can show each other with a group that shares some commonality with yours, the video, and then you can pitch your idea and discuss it for a bit, and then shift to a different group so you get exposed to as much feedback as possible. Just to mention, in earlier years, many earlier years, we tried to do a peer review system as people were developing ideas, drafts, and analysis drafts, and it just didn't work. It's really hard because groups are at different places, at different points of the course. But that's also something I might try again if I have this course again. So now we get to the course plan. First week, introduction, and Christiane will have is that on Friday, a practical exercise on how to read a paper, because you're going to have to read papers that are quite different from what you're used to. The second week, which is not next week, contrary to timetable, but it's the week after winter holidays, I asked specifically and wasn't sure that it had gone out of timetable. I'll write Uvaeka again. Apologies for that. But I couldn't rearrange childcare for my kids when the schools are closed next week. And I had planned to teach cognitive modeling, but I hadn't planned that I was teaching this. So sorry. So in 2 weeks, we will work on diversity and common ground in teamwork. And the practical exercise will actually be us running together. Partly you'll have to do a very small exercise at home, but mostly during the practical exercise, we will run a study and design the analysis to test ideas from the lecture. On week 3, we will apply these ideas to diversity and common ground in science. And the practical exercise will be trying to develop a mock-up exam project studying science from this perspective. On the 4th week, the 4th week is networks. And in the practical exercise, Christiane will engage you in analyzing social network data from many years ago classes of CogSci students. How do we think of the network? How do we visualize it? How do we quantify its properties? In week 5, we will have Arthur Yort from the Center for Management at the Business School and I always forget what it's called, but this new humongous center for language models that we established at the university, who will be introducing agent-based models, also with an angle on having these agents implementing language models to interact with each other, which is also something that Christiane did in her bachelor thesis. On the practical exercise, we will have an agent-based model experience workshop modeling El Farol, which is a very popular cafe in Santa Fe, and contagion happening as people attend that cafe, which will be led by Isa, who has a really cool project on using agent-based models to understand ancient civilizations. Week 6, we will deal with game theory, and Josh will come and present some of his work on trying to use game theory to understand inequality across different countries. And then Christiane will lead you into designing an ABM tournament where you will have to design your own strategy for the agent, and then these agents will be made compete with each other to see who of you has designed the best strategy. On week 7, we will have cultural transmission and evolution with a guest lecture by Elena Mew, who's a postdoc at archaeology and has done some extremely cool work on how and when we should learn from each other, how and when we should use what we learn from each other or innovate on what we learn from each other. And then Christiane again will engage you in a further ABM exercise if there's something more that we want to do, or if that's the time, we'll adjust it as it comes. We'll do group formation. We'll help you form in groups for the exam papers. On week 8, it's a weird week because there's no practical exercise. I think there's something else going on in our usual spot. We will do more specifically cultural evolution, and I will be talking a lot about how we can use what you learn to understand ancient development of how humans developed their very first symbolic behaviors. And then on week 9 to 11, we will organize one-on-one project supervision. And on week 12, we will have the What a Great Idea video fair. All the dates are actually put in Brightspace. If there's any change, they will be changed there, and you will be notified of that. Are there questions on this? Yes. So I think you've been assigned to classes, right? I don't know whether that's respecting the study groups. Yeah. So I'm actually very agnostic, right? You should feel free. I think the study group is a very natural way of sitting and working together, but I'm not like you're adults, right? So you can figure out who you want to sit with and work with. Sorry, I wasn't brought up in the Danish system. It keeps coming back. I had to shake the hand of the mayor, but still, I'm not a Dane enough. Of course. This was your cue, right? That's also the slide on your. No, but basically, as you're going to be reading papers that are very different from or some papers are going to be different from what you're used to. And in general, it's nice to get some scaffolding on how to read these papers. So the first practical exercises structure so that you actually are guided in discussing in how to read these papers, which means you don't need to read all the papers every week, but we will diversify by groups or by members of the group, depending on the week. And then Christiane will have activities on um, discussing different aspects, how to extract critically information and etc. When understanding a paper enough is enough, and when you should actually go into the details. I should also actually, I think I didn't put that information there, but generally lectures will be more frontal lectures, though I will try to get some discussion going. And the practical exercises are going to be very hands-on. When for every lecture, you will have a list of generally it's like 3 or 4 papers. It might be daunting to have to read all of them. I remember my student life, right? So I think that now for the practical exercise, Christiane has organized it as a matrix reading groups, meaning that you have one paper per group and then you exchange and discuss, but she'll get you an email. For more normal lectures, since we will not do all this structured discussion, it's probably a good idea if you meet with your study group, each of you having read one of the papers, and you give like a short version to each other. Good. So now I have half an hour. Good. I think we did it a bit, but let's actually take a minute where you think about in the context of social cognition, social and cultural dynamics. And of course, I've given you a few cues before, but what is social cognition? How would you define it? Take a minute on your own. Okay, now take a person sitting at your side and in 2 minutes try to discuss your definition of social cognition. Okay, so somebody feels comfortable to give some ideas? Yes. Context affects cognition and how cognition processes communication. Other inputs? Yes. 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 Good. Yes. Okay, now we're getting more specific. So before we had very broad range definitions. Now we have an example of how social recognition could manifest. Yes. Oh yeah, yeah. Moral cognition. Other examples? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Cool. Anything else? Yes. Are you thinking of the specific phenomenon that as soon as somebody expresses an opinion, everybody just converges on that, or more general thinking in groups? Yeah. Yes. Yes. I'm actually going to put it here. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you have a Marco blanket so that, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'll call it Marco blanket because I'm a nerd, but yes, you know what we mean. I think it was a point there. Yes. Yes. So here I'm just gonna say cognition versus social cognition. Yeah. Good. These are all very good points. Let me see how I try to unfold it. Right. So we have that a general, very general definition of cognition, which most people would agree with, is that cognition is information processing that mediates between input, for instance, perception, or actually sensation, and output, action. In the history of cognitive science, if you're that kind of history nerd, there is a pretty cool book called The History of the Mind by Howard Gardner, which is based on a lot of interviews to the founding fathers of or to the people who were at the first meetings there, this is what separates early psychological research that went under the uh, label of behaviorism from what we would call cognitivism. So in behaviorism, everything is a learned reaction to the environment. In meaning that you get an input and bam, you get an output. While what cognitivism does is trying to say, wait a second, something can happen to that input that comes in. There can be a very active processing, which is not just a reflex reacting to that, right? You're ruminating and getting anxious about the exam. And cognitive science is an attempt at describing, formalizing, and modeling these internal processing of information. This next point betrays how old my slides are because Mikkel Valentin used to teach Introduction to Cognitive Science and Cognitive Neuroscience. And in his idea, we can only call cognition an information processing that mediates between inputs and outputs and happens in the brain, because that gives us a very clear boundary to what is our object of study. Right? Traffic light that processes information about the traffic and decides when to turn red or green, not the study of cognitive science, he would say. I have a very different approach, and I put like a very old quote from one of my favorite philosophers that sort of brings my perspective here, that says, a psychologist cuts out a lobe of my brain, and you can see the word IRBs when he wrote this. And then when I find I cannot express myself, he says, you see, your faculty of language was localized in that lobe. Right? No doubt it was. And so if he had filched my inkstand or messed up my internet connection these days, turned off ChatGPT, right? Or silenced my research buddies, right? I should not have been able to continue my discussion until I had got another. Yet the very thoughts would not come to me. So my faculty of discussion is equally localized in my inkstand, right? Or research buddies or blah, blah, blah. And this is a provocation, but it's an idea that sometimes actually we want to start from the cognitive process, from the phenomenon that we're interested in, and then there can be very many active components in that. Once we get to social cognition, right, there is an idea that social should involve other people, right? And the first take that was very popular in the 80s, in the 90s, in the 2000s was that this means that we need to have one individual processing information about other people. And this was really pushed forward by, for instance, the first cognitive studies on autism, where the idea was that autistic individuals can cover the full range of cognitive abilities, right? From heavy cognitive impairments to highly talented individuals in terms of cognitive function. And however, what they are is mind blind. That is, they are less able to process specifically information which is about other people. This is something that's still, portrayed in a lot of movies and books and TV series and so on and so forth. So theory of mind, the ability to use external information to construct an internal representation of the other person, is a very specific cognitive function, different from other cognitive function, to the point that there are conditions in which these might be impaired but not the other ones, right? There's been other approaches to that. For instance, when you were bringing up mimicry, the mirror neurons, et cetera, there was this idea that as I observe you packing because it's getting late, right? I sort of stimulate, feel within myself these activity of packing and start also getting a bit anxious and see, ooh, in 15 minutes I can get on my bike, right? And through this sort of contagion, simulating the other, we actually do social cognition. And that's, again, it's something very different from looking a sponge on the table, from looking a ball rolling down a hill, because I don't put myself in the shoes of the ball, right? The second take is that as we do cognition, which is not necessarily social, it's hard not to take into account what other people are doing. So there's the social Simon effect, you know that, right? The idea that if I have to do a task, now I don't remember the details, but let's say I need to count the dots on the right side of the screen. And you put close to me Valeria, who has the task of counting the dots on the left side of the screen. Just the fact that she's there, counting the left dots on the screen, will change the way I process the screen, and I will tend to also pay attention to the left because I need to represent what she's doing. Or as I make choices, right, I need to pick which university, which education to take. Like if a lot of my classmates are applying to cognitive science, I might also integrate that, right? If I need to pick, a dish at the canteen and I see that that specific green blob is almost finished and people are just queuing to get it, maybe I'll go and get it, right? This is something that is more studied perhaps in ethology and anthropology, and it's called social learning. The third take on social cognition, which is equally valid, is that we can do information processing by interacting with other people, right? Of course, try to keep up a mental model of you and your understanding as I teach. And I try to process cues of your bored expression or your enthusiastic shaking your head and stuff like that to sort of adjust what I'm doing. But I don't need to go too deep. I can say, oh, there's a potential cue that something is not going wrong. And I say, are you following? Right? And then I elicit information that is much easier to process than actually building a complex model. There is a really cool paper by Van Arkel and Marieke van Strecht and Mark Dingemanze, etc., where they show that you can actually have, do you know what conversational repair is? So let's say a lot of the studies that try to investigate the origin of language say people need to have sophisticated social cognition skills, to the point that Michael Tomasello says that language is possible only thanks to the uniquely human ability to infer and represent others' mental states. And that puts a very high bar to learn a language. And what Marieke and collaborators are doing is saying, actually, if you give these agents the possibility to ask the other, then you can actually not only create much more complex interactions, but you can actually bootstrap much more sophisticated theory of mind abilities because you start from simpler things and you can build up, you create a path towards the complicated abilities. So a lot of the processing that we do of other people's actually happens in a very active way, asking, right? Looking for cues, trying to induce cues, right? There are some dilemmas in the study of social cognition. For instance, is social cognition different from general cognition? Are we relying on the same reinforcement learning and perceptual mechanisms when looking at others and trying to build ways of interacting with them? Or do we have a special module, right? Be it localized in the brain or not, but that's very specific to processing Alta's information. And there is a fantastic book for those of you who are interested in these discussions called Cognitive Gadgets by Cecilia Hayes, which actually tries to argue that we have some very basic cognitive mechanisms that are used across all domains. But as a species, we evolved cultural practices that specialize throughout development these cognitive mechanisms into social stimuli. So, for instance, by supporting joint attention, by pointing the child's attention to other people, by immersing the child in linguistic environments, which have certain affordances that an environment that's not linguistic doesn't have, and so on and so forth. And I don't think she's completely right, but she has some very interesting points. There's also some cool questions that we can ask, right? If initially we had these ideas that we look at a TV series or soap operas and we create mental states of the others is a key aspect of social cognition. We might also ask whether that's the same as having to interact with somebody in real person. My ability to construct a very sophisticated mental model of now I watch too many cartoons, like Vaiana, will not necessarily transfer well to having to interact live with you, asking me questions about the course, right? Because it's a very different time pressure that I'm at. And just to close this, these kind of discussions might seem very academic to a certain extent, but they actually have very strong implications. So when we study, for instance, so people with schizophrenia tend to show social impairment as difficulties in interacting with others, often impeding the development and maintenance of social relations, as well as studying or having a job, which of course feedback loop into the severity of the symptom. Because if your life falls apart, everything else falls apart. So we know very little about how this social impairment emerges, right? We have questionnaires that people fill out, relatives, clinical practitioners, the patients themselves, but how does it actually work? And so existing social cognition takes might say, well, maybe schizophrenic patients process social information differently. For instance, we can give them theory of mind, eye tracking on social pictures, and stuff like that. Other people might say perhaps patients with schizophrenia have the mimicry mechanism impaired, right? They imitate others differently. There's been a very cool study that did a large cohort investigation of this traditional social cognition task as established by a consensus of experts. And there's a YouTube video if you're interested in seeing about, learning more about that, but it doesn't really predict how well they function in society, right? Well, I'm going to skip that, but I've been trying to solve that problem. Similar problem happens in autism. Autistic people tend to show social impairment. How does this social impairment emerge, right? Again, there are studies taking social cognition tasks like theory of mind, social motivation, the processing of social information, and these all are very poor predictors of actual functioning. Right? They don't tell us about real life social cognition, if we want. There is a very interesting movement called the neurodiversity movement. I don't know how much you've heard about that, but it's basically started initially from a few activists, often with neurodiversity conditions, mostly autism, sometimes ADHD, sometimes combination of this, which is trying to push that instead the social impairment is emerging as the effect of a mismatch in expectations. Meaning, as I meet Christiane on the street and we start talking, right, we have expectations that Christiane will not start speaking for 30 minutes, right, about the budget of her cafe in Fobo, but that she might have like a minute and a half, and I might then jump in and say something, and then she'll at least ask questions about that, and then she'll jump in again, right? But that's not necessarily the case for autistic individuals. Some of these autistic activists claim, for whom maybe not 30, but 10 minutes monologue followed by a 10 minutes monologue of the other person might be perfectly satisfactory. Also, there's ideas about back channels, right? I rely on you nodding. If you stop nodding, I will sort of have more false starts. I will raise my voice. I will start jumping around, right? There's studies actually showing that. The claim is that maybe some of these autistic individuals are finding back channels sensory overloading. These back channel, I am actually trying to formulate myself, and you just keep sending me signals. What the heck are you doing, bro? Right? And so the claim is that autistic interactions will be just as functional as neurotypical interactions. And here, there are some studies trying to claim that. For instance, autistic peer-to-peer information transfer is highly effective. And I've been lucky enough to get an NIH grant before Trump went to power, which is called Connect, where we actually trying to investigate these seriously. So we have 560 adolescents across the United States who will interact with each other. Half of them have autism, half of them are neurotypical. They will be matched so that each of them will have a conversation with somebody of the same neurotype and a conversation with somebody of a different neurotype. And we will try to actually test their traditional social cognition, but also their ability to create rapport during these conversations. And we will look at how these rapport emerges throughout the conversation. And I think that it's super cool. And if any of you is interested, probably not this year, we won't have enough data yet, but next year we'll sure have some data. And I've also done work on echolalia and turn taking in autism that tries to take this more, how is the other reacting to what you're doing? How is it perceived? What's your expectation? How is the rapport emerges in this exchange between two people instead of a person with an impairment and creating all the issue, right? Perfectly on time. What's next? I want you to do the 3 readings for next lecture. You don't need to have read all 3, but it's quite useful if in the study group, one person has read at least one person has read. You have at least 3 people, and the 3 people have read each a different paper, and you've discussed them a bit, because I will want to have a bit of discussion in class, but I'll have the lecture. And then I will share with you sometimes late this week PsychoPy script for you to run to collect some Scrabble data so we can do teamwork together on that. And with that, thank you. This was fun.